Hello everyone. Today we're going to be continuing with the series on excerpts from Alphonsus for the purposes of understanding how you should act around dressing, around modesty. The last video was on customs. This video is on one of the parts of charity towards others. It's part of the theological virtue of charity, and it is the part directed to others. So this is on fraternal correction. If someone is committing sins, when is it your responsibility to correct them? What should you say? Here's the table of contents. On what account are we held to correct our neighbor? What about if it's just a small sin, if it's a venial sin? What if it's a sin from ignorance? What if correction is omitted on account of fear, if you're scared? What if you're held to correct? Are you held to correct if you're unsure of whether the other person is sinning? How about when the danger of relapse is gone, when there's no more chance of them sinning again? Or if another more suitable person is present, or if there is no hope that they will change, or if the occasion hasn't presented itself yet. Who are the people that are held to correct others? And is there an order to be preserved when correcting others? And then finally, there's the resolution of specific cases. First, why correct? Fraternal correction is an admonition whereby someone tries to recall their neighbor from sin. If you know someone who's sinning around you, you tell them, hey, that's a sin, don't do that, that's bad. That's an example of fraternal correction. Fraternal correction is found both in the natural law and communities and in divine positive law. In the natural law, this is just the care for the community. To care for the community, you need good, virtuous citizens, and part of that is going to be correcting the citizens. This is part of the love of neighbor, charity towards others. You want them to do well. Then from the divine positive law, we have Matthew 18. If your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault, just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over. But if they will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church, and if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. This is the prescribed order of fraternal correction, which we'll talk about more later. There are exceptions to this specific order, but it is kept in general. First, the mortal sin of your neighbor. Every mortal sin of your neighbor is, per se, a sufficient matter obliging correction. If your neighbor is sinning mortally, you are definitely obliged to correct him. There are other conditions later, but if it's at all possible, this is something you are obliged to do. It would, and the reason for this is that it destroys the spiritual life of your neighbor every time they commit the sin. On the subject of venial sins and their correction, it's actually rare for you to be obliged to correct venial sins. The reason is that they're not as serious, they're very common. There is an exception, which is for the religious. To maintain spiritual discipline, the religious require an almost complete lack of venial sin in their life, and thus they require correction more often than others, because they have the special responsibility of being a kind of exemplar or a paragon of virtue for the community they're in. What about sins committed in invincible ignorance? So invincible ignorance is just when you do something bad and you had no knowledge, or you didn't have sufficient knowledge that it was a bad thing for you to do. There are different cases where you could be committing a sin in invincible ignorance. One is against a precept of natural law. If by some miracle you don't know that fornication is a bad thing, then it would be someone's it would be someone's obligation who's close to you to correct you. Say, hey, stop fornicating, dog. That's bad. If it's against a precept of divine law, if it's blasphemy against God that you commit regularly, again, they are definitely held to correct you, if it is at all possible. If it's against a precept of human positive law, this is what we think of as like normal laws, like speed limits, drinking laws, paying your taxes, not assaulting random people. These are precepts of human positive law. So positive law is a little bit different. So you're probably held to correct your neighbor on like instances of them breaking human positive law, but not always. There are people that have a special responsibility of correction here, and that is those with authority over the person or those who are teaching the person. So if you're the person's parent and they're breaking a positive law, you should correct them. The same with teachers, the same with the priest that has authority over the person. They would all be absolutely bound to correct someone who was acting against a precept of positive law. However, most people are obliged in most circumstances to correct that anyway. What about failure? What if you fail to correct someone's sin from fear or shyness? Not a rational fear. That's something we'll touch on later. But if you're simply scared of talking to the person, or you're shy, you you don't want to be seen as like overbearing or something. That would actually constitute at least a venial sin and occasionally a mortal sin. What about doubt? Can you correct someone when there is doubt about whether they sin? The answer is actually that you have no obligation. You probably shouldn't do it because there's a good chance you could be wrong. Now, if you're a superior, so if you're a parent or a teacher or a religious superior or something like that, you're held to investigate whether a sin has taken place. If this is a situation where there's like some idea that a person is committing a sin, but you're not certain, then you're held to investigate to a reasonable extent whether they sinned. Others are exempt from correcting someone unless if they suspect a serious sin. So in cases where you're unsure about whether they committed a sin, then the correction is optional. But if it's so serious that it would be an actual tragedy, like a real tragedy, for the sin to go uncorrected, such as in a case of homicide or a sin that affects the community, then it is required that you actually correct them, even if there's doubt about whether they committed the sin. And then priests are held to investigate because they have special care of their flocks. This is something that was noted separately. What about relapse? When there is no danger of relapse, is there an obligation to correct? So this is about habitual sins, and it's about the end of the habit. So if someone is like finally kicking the habit, and like they no longer are likely to commit the sin, is there an obligation to correct? Now, when I say no longer likely, I mean like they're not likely to commit the sin if you correct them. The first opinion is no. Penance is not immediate. Why should correction be immediate after the threat of relapse is no longer present? And the second opinion, which is Alphonsus's and my own opinion, is yes. That the person, as soon as they are competent to stop sinning, correcting them is good. That is one of the most important aspects of whether it's proper for you to correct someone for a sin they're committing, is whether they will relapse, depending on whether you talk to them. Okay, not an effective correction. What if there's an equal doubt about whether the correction will be helpful or not? Is there still an obligation to correct them? The answer is not necessarily. There are situations like before which are serious enough that you could be obliged to correct someone when you think the correction won't work, but in most cases, in almost all cases, you're not held to correct someone when you're unsure of whether the correction will work or not. So the cases where they must be corrected, even if you don't think they'll listen to you, are cases where there's danger of death, where you fear that if you don't correct them, they may leave the faith, or it is probable that the guilty party will become reasonable on correction. There is actually another case when doubtful correction in this sense, or ineffective correction, is necessary, but that's more related to scandal. We'll get to that in a minute. People with special obligations. Bishops, prelates, teachers, parents, and guardians have special obligations to correct. Though only bishops and prelates are held to correct at the risk to their own lives. If a bishop or a prelate or like a local priest, if they notice that a serious sin is taking place in their flock and they fail to correct it out of fear for their life and not for some other excellent reason, they are actually in at least a case of venial sin for failing in their duty to take care of their flock. They are held to correct even at danger, even at risk to their own life. Next, we have the order of operation. When correcting someone, first you should correct them in private, then you should correct them with one or two witnesses present if they fail to listen to you, and then if that fails again, you should talk to a priest and correct them in the presence of the priest. That's pretty simple. If you're not in a situation where the priest is the superior, maybe you would replace the priest with a teacher or a principal at your school or your boss at work or something like that. Then we have some exceptions. If the sinner offers to talk to a priest in order to keep the sin private, you should keep the sin private. Just let him talk to the priest or the manager. You shouldn't unnecessarily publicize his sin. If the sin was public, then you actually are allowed to admonish him in public with witnesses the first time. But this is only if the sin was a public affair. If it was a private thing, then it must be kept private until at least step 2 in the process. If he's planning on harming a third person in the community or the community itself, like if it's like a person planning on fornication or something. I don't know if people plan that, but if that's what's happening, or if he's like stealing from like the church or like a local store or something, it's actually admissible to go directly to the superior. You don't need to carry out the second step. It's serious enough that you should go straight to the authorities if they are hurting other people in the community through their sin. And then finally, if for some reason the person has to be captured to prevent them from sin, they should be shown to the authorities immediately instead of bringing witnesses to talk to them first if capture is necessary. Then finally, we have a conversation of different principles and cases. One who fails to easily prevent a friend from sinning from fear of something temporal, and so that's not the fear of sin, commits a mortal sin. So this is a person whose friend is committing a mortal sin, and they could easily prevent them. And the only reason they don't is like maybe it'll be kind of painful, or maybe they'll lose some money, or maybe the person will be mad at them. They commit a mortal sin if they fail to prevent their friend from sinning. Now, I want to be clear, it has to be a fear of something temporal. If they fear that they will sin, or they will cause someone else to sin in the process, that would not fall under this case. So it has to be a fear of something other than sin. Yeah. If a man ceases from a secret sin with no chance of the sin coming back, it would be a mortal sin to denounce him to a priest. Don't publicize people's sins. It's not your job. It's called detraction. If you are able to keep the sin private, and he's not going to sin again, it would be a sin for you to publicize his sin. That is detraction. That is a sin in itself. Making known the faults of others unnecessarily is a sin. Yeah. If an immediate superior can correct a delinquent properly, it would be a sin to tell immediate superior. So if you're in school and your teacher is able to correct some delinquent, it would be a sin for him to go to the principal. He can just correct the child himself. He does not require the help of the principal. He's, again, unnecessarily alerting other people of this person's shortcomings. Prelates and supervisors should never investigate an individual with too much without special reason. So actually, prelates and superiors are always supposed to be investigating everyone a little bit, but they shouldn't pay too much attention to individuals without good reason. Priests are held to correct and impede private and public sins at danger to their life, and even to call for the repentance of public figures who have no hope of return to the church. So earlier I was talking about people who are unlikely to repent even if they are told to stop sinning. These people are still supposed to be corrected by priests. An excellent example of this is Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden in America. They are in very public, very mortal sin on the subject of abortion. And it is the duty of priests and bishops in America to publicly repudiate them and chastise them for the sin they are committing, even at risk to the priest's own life. Now, it's unlikely that this is going to happen, but even if there were people threatening a priest with death for saying something like that, it would still be his duty to repudiate someone like Nancy Pelosi or maybe a local politician for doing something like publicly supporting abortion. Finally, the correction need not happen immediately. You don't have to correct someone the second you find out they're sinning. You can wait for a good time to do it. Don't wait too long, but you are allowed to wait for, a suitable time to correct them. And then finally, you can't give up. If there is a decent chance that the person will listen to you on a second or a third correction, you are bound to make the second and the third and the fourth and the fifth correction until you think there's absolutely no chance that the person will stand for correction. They will actually listen to you. I hope you learned something. I'll answer questions in the comments of these if you guys have any, because these ones are a little weird.